This afternoon we'll be hearing from four witnesses: Ms Rose Webb, the Deputy Secretary of the Better Regulation Division and Commissioner of Fair Trading, Department of Customer Service; Mr John Tansey, the Executive Director, Better Regulation Division, Department of Customer Service; and Mr Andrew Gavriladis, the Executive Director, Community Engagement, Better Regulation Division, Department of Customer Service. And we'll be joined by Mr Peter Dunphy, the Executive Director, Compliance and Dispute Resolution, Better Regulation Division, Department of Customer Service, when he concludes his obligations in another hearing this afternoon. Ms Webb, Mr Tansey and Mr Gavriladis, as you've all been previously sworn in this inquiry, we can get straight into it. Did you have a brief opening that you wanted to put on the record, Ms Webb?
No, Chair. The only thing we just wanted to mention was that as Mr Dunphy will be coming a bit later, there may be some questions that we might have to ask the committee's indulgence that we wait for him to come. That's all we wanted to mention.
No, that's okay. That can be taken on.
Seems very likely.
That can be taken on a very brief notice. Well, given that, I might hand over to the opposition to commence questioning.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
Mr Sewell.
Ms Webb, are you aware of correspondence from the Shadow Minister to the Minister in relation to calls by choice for action to introduce consumer protections to stop price gouging on the sale of essential items during the pandemic situation?
Yes, I have seen that correspondence. I've seen the correspondence from Choice. I don't know if I've seen the letter from the Opposition Minister.
Well, I think you can assume it's sort of supportive of the Choice trajectory, if I can put it that way. What initial responses does the agency have to the proposals from Choice?
So, as I understand it, Choice wrote to all the Australian jurisdictions and the Commonwealth. So we've been discussing it in the context of the Australian Consumer Law Agency's committees that have been dealing with COVID-related matters to make sure that we did a joined-up response across all the jurisdictions. We've recognised, and I think most agencies have indicated, that there's some Commonwealth law relating to specific items and price gouging in relation to those specific items, hand sanitisers and some other products like that, and that the agreement is that those matters would be referred to the Federal Police, and that's the way they'd be dealt with under that very specific Commonwealth legislation. In relation to price gouging more generally, we've just considered what avenues there are under the Australian Consumer Law to take action already. And there is some opportunity if people are being misled or deceived about the circumstances in which the pricing has changed or has been increased. Potentially it could be unconscionable in certain circumstances, but the agreement between the Australian consumer law regulators is that apart from using those provisions at this stage, we weren't going to propose to the Ministerial Council on Consumer Affairs that there be any change to the law.
Okay, can you just step me through that sort of federal dimension? What are those items and why is it a federal issue?
So the Australian consumer law applies in all the jurisdictions, and it applies in New South Wales. We've applied it as a law, and the intergovernmental agreement that governs the way it works is that we won't go off on our own tangents making amendments to consumer-related laws unless they're consistent with that Australian consumer law framework, but as best as possible that laws are changed with all states and territories agreeing to the change and the Commonwealth enacting it first. And so that's why when we think about things like price gouging and a general consumer application across all consumer goods, it was considered appropriate to consider it in the context of the Australian consumer law rather than a state-by-state arrangement.
Okay, but I mean, in the real world, it's a bit hard for people to take action, particularly in the middle of a pandemic when there is an acute shortage of certain goods. So whether or not it's deceptive or misleading, obviously price hikes, which of course have been reported quite consistently during the pandemic, are very worrying. This jurisdiction, I believe, has done it in relation to ticket resale and so-called scalping practices. Why not put something into the law generally prohibiting price gouging in relation to essential goods, at least linked during a public health crisis?
Well, I think...
Would that not be consistent with the consumer law?
So my understanding is the Commonwealth identified some particular products that there was a concern about specific price gouging related to COVID, and it enacted that legislation that I mentioned before. More generally, you know, the theory of how markets work is that you let people price as they will, and people will not buy things that are overly expensive, and will be able to, make their own choices as individual consumers. And so therefore, in theory, price control legislation is not used widely across any jurisdiction in Australia. And recognising that some of these concerns that Choice and others raised were temporary phenomena in relation to particular items, Minister Anderson did put out a public warning and said that he would name and shame, people who he found consistently and unreasonably pricing above market prices and potentially impacting consumers. As it turned out, we've been scouring our complaints register every day to see if we do have any particular consumer complaints, and every single one has been of such a transitory nature, and when people overprice, other people just don't buy it and the price falls down, that we've struggled to find any examples that were worthy of actual regulatory action. And so I think, having regard to all those factors, we consider that the law as it is sufficient to deal with the situation, noting, of course, the importance of making sure that we keep watching what's happening out there in the market.
Well, how does that help people in remote communities who might have less choice about, shopping diversity? I absolutely understand that people in remote communities have less choice about shopping opportunities, but that's sort of a feature that's not related to COVID. That's something that they're impacted by every day. So we're very aware of that. I think what we're seeing is that the move to online purchasing has actually allowed people in remote and regional communities to have more choice. And that might be one of the factors that is meaning that people aren't complaining, that people have these opportunities now to purchase elsewhere if they need to. But we literally aren't seeing it, notwithstanding our very strong regard for looking out for this type of conduct to see what we could do about it. Okay. John, did you?
One of the questions I might just ask you to come back to and answer is just, what were those items that the Commonwealth regulated?
Yes, absolutely. We can. I
Give
think
us
I think it was sort of hand sanitizer, face masks, and things like that. But we can absolutely identify the regulation for you and show you.
Yeah. So the key ones, in fact, the key ones that Choice are drawing attention to.
That's right.
Yeah. So the Commonwealth did choose to regulate a number of those, and has there been any assessment of how effective that has been?
Well, as I mentioned, the agreement between all the jurisdictions has been that should we come across any item of concern in that category, that we would refer them immediately to the Australian Federal Police. I'm not aware of anyone ending up with any law enforcement action being taken. I'm just checking with my colleagues, but we could check that and just see if they have taken any action under that regulation.
So you're not aware of any action in relation to, are you aware, were there referrals in New South Wales, from New South Wales?
I don't think so, but I would double check and just let you know. I'm not aware that we ended up referring anything, but I'll just check with our team to make sure I'm.
Yeah, but such a
not
referral
missing
would
something.
have come through fair trading.
Yes, it would have been the fair trading team. We've got the protocols that we agreed with all the jurisdictions about how the matters would move from the jurisdiction to the Australian Federal Police. They weren't going to have to come via me, but I can check and see whether that happened. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm surprised to hear that after scouring the complaints register, you've struggled to find any examples that required regulatory action. Can you give us some?
Yeah.
Clearly there's been a lot of anecdotal discussion
Yep.
about this. I think shoppers have seen shortages and increased prices. Just talk us through how big you think the problem was.
So we did receive not so much from complaints from consumers, but more by observations by our staff members. We did see some circumstances in which products like detergent, toilet paper were priced quite a lot, but by the time someone went back down to the shop to have a look and take some proper evidence of it, the price had come down again, indicating to us that possibly it wasn't a very successful method for them. We certainly saw a little bit on eBay of people attempting to sell some of these products at quite inflated prices, but again, they weren't very successful because the competition from other people selling the same products meant that the prices were lower. There was a circumstance where ginger was increased for a while because I think the understanding was that some people believed that was a good remedy for COVID-related matters.
Jeez,
But
don't
again,
tell Donald Trump.
Indeed.
that was our understanding of why ginger prices suddenly escalated in some groceries. But again, it was a temporary phenomena, and there was plenty of other consumer choice. I think,
Some complaints figures.
yeah, Mr. Gavrilides has some actual figures of how many actual complaints
Yes,
we've received
okay, that'd be
that he
helpful.
might be able to help you with. Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
So from the beginning of the year until about mid-May, we received 47 complaints and 146 inquiries about pricing. And out of the 47 complaints that we received, so these are complaints that are coming in from consumers, from people who are actually out and about. Only 2 of the complaints alleged price gouging, but that wasn't necessarily the case. But I'm just saying that we've only had 47 inquiries about pricing generally.
And so you've given us an overall picture, but what about in relation to those products which you say the Commonwealth has felt it might need to regulate, those products that Choice says New South Wales should specifically regulate? Can you give us any picture in relation to things like face masks, gloves, gowns, sanitiser?
I can recollect someone showing me one photo of some hand sanitizer at a looked like inflated price, but as I said, when we got down to the shop to just check the details of it, the price had gone back down again. There was one relating to toilet paper, but I think again it was found out that these were industrial rolls of toilet paper, and so the price was relevant to the quantity was correct. I'm not sure about face masks, but we could check. I don't know that we've had any, but we could find out. Yeah.
All right, so when you look across the board, even at these items that were hard to find, hard to buy,
Yeah.
over recent months,
Yeah.
the fair trading view or the agency view is really no temporary issues, really no problem though.
Yes, I think that's where we landed. As I said, we were keeping a close watch on this because of the interest from Choice, but also from the public more generally. And, it was always the thought that if it got, that we've had some demonstrated examples that price gouging was occurring on a substantial and permanent scale, we would reconsider our advice to the Minister, but at the moment, we just couldn't see anything that suggested that was necessary.
Why? I mean, there were widespread. Toilet paper's the most extreme example. Sanitiser was another one. These were just not available, and no consumers are talking to the agency.
Tissues, pasta.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no,
I
exactly.
went looking for them all.
Yeah, no, precisely.
Yeah, right.
So, why? No one's complaining about these. Is that
People were complaining about the lack of supply.
right? Well, up to 47, but that's hardly anyone, really.
Yeah, well, that's right. And it wasn't, as I say, the Minister did put out a media release and we did public warnings. The ACCC and the other consumer affairs agencies all had information on their website about what was price gouging and what could be done, and indicated they were interested in hearing from the public. So I don't know. I mean, I know there was a lot of anecdote, and we were very conscious of that and watching out for anything that we should take action on.
This might be a difficult question for you, but is it possible that this lack of public feedback reflects the sort of view of the agency? I mean, over in recent years, it seems the agency has become, shall we say, one of so-called light-handed regulation. Once upon a time, fair trading used to take prosecutions for aggrieved consumers. Do you still do that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, again, there's a number of people I've dealt with in the last few years whose interactions with fair trading have not been very happy because fair trading essentially leaves it to the consumer to pursue their own legal remedies. I'm just wondering whether this is something you need to have a look at about how consumers actually view the agency.
Well, look, I mean, from my perspective, we take prosecutions every year. We've taken civil actions. We do a lot of other remedies for consumers.
How many prosecutions?
Overall for fair trading, I didn't bring those figures because I thought we were talking about COVID-related matters. So, but I can get that on
during
notice
the COVID
absolutely
period,
for you.
then. During the COVID,
How
during the
many
period of the public health orders, which is what
Yeah.
we looked at.
Yeah.
What
They
other
weren't
prosecutions?
COVID-related prosecutions, but how many?
How do you know?
I'll have to.
Okay, you say that. What were the prosecutions for?
unlicensed building, defrauding
So it
people
wasn't-
from
so-
trust accounts.
Okay, so
things
but
like
what in the consumer in the
in like
traditional
Australian consumer law prosecutions. I can get those figures on notice for you on how many Australian consumer law matters we've dealt
And
with.
in relation, so let's now, so I accept what you're putting as I accept you're putting that as the agency view, but to turn to some of those anecdotes,
Yep.
I mean, there certainly there certainly was hand sanitizer being sold at the point at which it disappeared, well above the market price. I certainly didn't report this to Fair Trading.
Why not?
But I certainly saw
cover up.
hand sanitizer being pulled out from underneath the register to be sold for more than $30 a bottle for something that would have been
Yep.
4 or 5, or perhaps you might now get for 8. None of these issues have come forward to Fair Trading. I'm quite surprised to hear that. Oh, this was routine.
I mean,
in my
every one of our complaints officer was well and truly on notice that this was an absolute high priority for
Yeah.
us and the minister. And we were looking out, as I said, every day saying, we're hearing exactly these anecdotes and the media interest, and we were being asked,
Yeah.
were there examples? And we were looking for them, but
And you're aware of the examples that were canvassed in the media about mask supplies.
yes, and followed them up when we heard about them.
So
yes.
talk us through those examples when you followed those up.
So when we
What
followed
was
them up,
specifically going on with face masks?
I mean, I can't talk about a specific case. I take that on notice, but generally, when we got a complaint or there was a media report about something, we would follow up and see what the pricing was, and it seemed to be a very common phenomena that the person was not successful in selling at that high price because there was competition from other people, and they'd put the price down. That's not to say that some consumers didn't buy it at the high price. I absolutely acknowledge that. But in terms of finding enough evidence of a persistent high price that we would think it was appropriate to issue a public warning for, we just didn't come across an example.
And in your view, is it, just coming back to the question you've been asked about the capacity of New South Wales to act alone,
Yeah.
so there is an intergovernmental agreement that, provides some framework for how we might
Yeah.
go it alone, though. It provides some framework for coordinated action. In your view, can New South Wales act by itself? Whether it's advisable to do that is another question.
Yep.
New South Wales can act or cannot act on this unilaterally?
I think in terms of amending the Australian consumer law, we couldn't act, but that's not to say that we couldn't amend some other specific piece of New South Wales legislation that might have the same effect.
Same effect,
But I would just check the intergovernmental agreement to make sure I'm exactly right about that.
And that might bring obligations to tell the Commonwealth or other jurisdictions, but we could have that effect unilaterally in New South Wales law
in
if we chose.
in relation to a very specific regulatory scheme, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
if that's wise is another question, but there's nothing to constrain us that you're aware of, taking that.
Look, I think if we enacted something that was broad enough that it actually in effect amended the way the Australian consumer law operated in New South Wales, it would start to verge into being in conflict with the intergovernmental agreement. But I think Mr. Searle gave the example of ticket pricing before, and that because that's a very particular scheme, controlling the price in very particular circumstances where there's a clause in the arrangements, the terms and conditions about reselling, then that particular scheme can operate in New South Wales differently
Sure,
to other
but I mean
states.
that's a kind of question of detail. I mean, it was really on the back of sustained community and commercial unease with the scalping practices that led to these provisions, and surely potential price gouging of regular citizens in a pandemic when people lack the sort of usual bargaining power to be able to walk to another store. I think it's, I'm not so sure it's an opposite.
I was just using that as an explanation of how we could move away from the Australian consumer law in a particular circumstance.
So provided it was limited, provided it possibly time limited as well, or in a
Related to a
pandemic
specific type of
class of
consumer interaction, we might be able to, yes.
Yeah. Okay. No, very good. Do you?
Okay, go.
Yeah, okay.
Keep going.
The
Go your hardest.
in relation to those complaints you've received, so 47 complaints and 146 inquiries, so what did they, you've told us what they largely didn't relate to. 2 of them were for price gouging. What did the others largely relate to?
Do you have any more detail, Andrew?
I don't have any more detail. They were pricing in general. That's all I have at this point.
So pricing, you said that some of them might be about lack of goods altogether. Is that
No, I didn't
the
say
case
that.
or? No, okay, so these were about pricing. They were not about, for example, not being able to get toilet paper.
No,
They're not in those
no,
146 inquiries.
no.
Okay.
And I should mention, in terms of the total complaints that we've received year to date, we've had 19,067 complaints that we've received year to date, which is just up 3% from the previous year, same period. Just to give you an indication that people are still coming to fair trading to seek support.
And how many additional complaints were in the misleading and deceptive category? Presumably they're additional.
I don't have
separate?
that breakdown.
I'd have to take that.
Yep. And those are captured on the complaints register.
So sorry, I used the word complaints register in a general term there. We do have a specific complaints register that we publish each month. I meant the internal complaints data that we get every day as people ring up with complaints or put complaints in through our system. Yeah.
And turning to remote communities, can you just...
Time's up.
I am perfectly comfortable with this, having snuck in the first syllable for Mr Graham to continue.
Don't cut into our time. That's
Make sure there's 15 minutes.
just turning to that remote communities question, you've given us a view about what might be one thing that's easing that. I'm interested, though, in the agency's view about whether this is still a problem at the moment and whether it was a problem in the months previous. The sort of shortages and, well, obviously not price gouging, given what you're telling us, but the shortages in particular. Is that a problem? Was it a problem?
I mean, as a general proposition, people in remote communities often have less consumer choice, so I absolutely acknowledge that's a problem and that prices may tend to be higher for them. Whether we had any particular reports in relation to, during the COVID period, the shortages being exacerbated by that, I'll have to take on notice. I mean, I know from reading the newspaper and the media reports that certainly some regional areas did have issues getting supplies, so I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case, but I'd have to check whether we had specific people bringing specific examples to our attention.
Okay.
Education Minister referred to an example on a question without notice regarding hand sanitizer in certain schools.
Yeah.
There was a complete lack of local supplies.
Yeah, yeah.
Ms Webb, Ms Gavriladis, Ms Tansey, thank you for your attendance this afternoon. I didn't get the exact number of complaints down that you said that had been received. Ms Gavriladis, I think that was you.
So in terms of total complaints and online inquiries, we've received 19,000 complaints, 19,067 complaints year to date.
All right, that's from 1 January.
That's from 1 January.
How many prosecutions have been launched, do you know?
Unfortunately, we didn't bring our general sort of list of cases and prosecutions with us, so we'll have to take that on notice.
All right. Yeah. There have been repeated, it's not just coming from the Education Minister, but I think you couldn't have your eyes and ears open to have not heard repeated concerns, particularly about shortages in regional New South Wales. I'm just wondering what, if anything, your office has done to seek to address that. Now, it may be you haven't done anything because you haven't had a formal complaint made to you in that regard, but what, if anything, has been done?
So I don't think we've had a formal complaint, but I will check that. In terms of what we could have done under the pieces of legislation that we're empowered to implement, I'm not really sure. We can't direct sort of supplies of goods to go anywhere particular in the state. And so I guess unless we thought that the shortage was due to some, genuinely misleading and deceptive conduct of some sort, or that there was some market manipulation going on that we should refer to the ACCC, I'm not quite sure what legislation would have allowed us to do in relation to a shortage.
So if not you,
Yep.
if you did have evidence of a shortage, and it was causing significant issues, which government agency would you refer that problem to? Where would you send it?
Yeah. I think we would just make some inquiries about whether the shortage was due to there being a genuine lack of the product in New South Wales, and that, you know, the only thing to do was to import more or do some or produce more, or if we thought there was someone trying to manipulate the market by trying to sort of short the market in some way by some sort of cartel arrangement or something like that, we could have considered referring it to the ACCC. So I have absolutely no sense that that was happening in hand sanitizer, but it is known in other markets that people keep supply back in order to keep the price up, and they can only do that if they have an anti-competitive agreement with other suppliers to make sure that no one undercuts them.
Or
So
if
there
they're
would be
in
some
regional
options
New
there.
South Wales, you don't need an agreement if you've got the only shop in town.
Yeah. And so if you've had the only shop in town and the reason that you weren't selling the product, I think I'm understanding you correctly, was because you couldn't obtain source from your wholesaler, or because you had the product but you weren't selling it?
You're the one who's put
Yeah.
kind of motive and intent. That wasn't
okay.
in my question.
Yeah, okay.
I was just talking about a
Yeah.
shortage.
I mean, a shortage itself, I don't think there's any law in New South Wales that will cure a shortage as such. I think you have to work out, is there something, why the shortage is occurring?
So,
Yeah.
so if the pandemic, if that panic buying and the shortages had become chronic,
Yeah.
there was no part of the New South Wales government whose responsibility it was to actually step up and try and ensure the supply of critical products.
Look,
Hand sanitizer,
I'm
toilet
absolutely
paper.
not an expert in the Public Health Act, but I don't. Does it have some power in? It may have some power in there in these circumstances for them to enter into the market and direct the market a bit more. I'd have to take it on notice. I just have no knowledge of whether maybe the State's Emergency Powers Act, the police or something. But I'm sorry, I just don't know. Yeah.
You know, I asked this question because in other jurisdictions, Taiwan, for example, they saw early on there was going to be critical shortage in hand sanitizer, and then they mobilised resources to ensure adequate amount was produced. But there's no machinery that you're aware of that you can point to now
I don't want to
that
sell
would have
New
assisted
South
that.
Wales. I don't want to sell New South Wales procurement short, because I understand what they did do was to mobilise some resources for people to manufacture hand sanitizer, and that's why the supply increased. But look, I'm just talking about this from my reading. Generally,
I'm
in
more
the
than happy
media,
for you to
I
take
don't.
it on notice.
Yeah, so I think New South Wales procurement did try and
can
address
inject
those
themselves into the
shortages.
market. Their circumstances are slightly different at any tick of the clock, one suspects.
Yeah, nevertheless, they did
Argument here.
Nevertheless, they did it. Ms Webb, the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Bill was assented to, I think on Monday, is that right? Or Wednesday? On Wednesday?
Yes.
So that as I understand the terms of that bill, the powers, the substantive powers are now in place, is that right?
Mr. Tansey,
No,
I
it
think
commences in
commenced on
September.
1 September. Yeah.
All right. What, if any, arrangements are in place to ensure that there's an adequate number of authorised officers appointed to actually exercise the powers under that bill?
In relation to COVID?
Or
The reason I'm asking you is because it's in relation to building more generally, but the issue of building and a rapid expansion of building is related to COVID, because that's been expressed by the Premier and the Treasurer. Premier and the Treasurer is one of the economic responses to COVID, a construction-led recovery. So yes, in relation to COVID, but by that form.
So we have done a recruitment process to engage additional people for the building commissioner. I didn't come with my list of how many people responded to that advertisement, but it was in the many of hundreds, I understand. And the building commissioner is at this very moment going through the process of assessing those applications and determining who he will recruit to undertake that task. So there'll be this additional team that the building commissioner is recruiting, and then that will be supplemented by officers from Better Regulation Division.
Was that recruitment for the people to exercise to become authorised officers and exercise the power?
Under the Residential Buildings, Apartment Buildings
Residential
Act,
Apartment
yes.
Buildings
Yes,
Compliance
specific,
Enforcement
we're
Powers Bill. We
recruiting-
call that the RAB Bill.
Okay, great.
Is that easier?
Yep.
Yep. How many positions have been recruited or are in the process of being recruited? What's the number?
Mr. Dunphy's the one who's been working very closely with Mr. Chandler on the recruitment process, so he would be able to confirm for sure. I think I'd be guessing. So as soon as Mr. Dunphy comes,
I
he'll be able to
strongly
answer that.
urge you not to guess,
Yeah.
Ms. Webb. How many additional staff from the department, in addition to the recruitment, is it proposed be provided with those powers and then be subject to the direction of the building commissioner? And it may be they are two different numbers.
Yes, and I think it may also depend on the outcome of this recruitment process, and also from now until the 1st of September, the plan is to get all our project plans and operating arrangements in place to exercise the powers, and that I think will indicate to us as well how many people we'll need to be able to start on 1 September. So I think, as I understand, but Mr. Dunphy might be able to confirm, we're still working on exactly how many people we will need.
So, I mean, is it really the case that you actually haven't even identified the proposed head count? Is it really still at that early stage? You haven't got the structure in place sufficiently that you can identify what the proposed head count is?
I might defer that till Mr. Dunphy comes. I have seen an org chart, but I'm just off the top of my head not being able to remember the numbers on it. Yeah.
In terms of the organisational structure, how is it intended that the building commissioner will fit within the organisational structure now that this act has been passed? Are there any changes? And if not, what's the arrangement?
So, again, Mr. Dunphy is probably better placed to explain in detail, but my understanding is that he will have teams underneath him who'll be allocated to particular building projects and building sites. And those teams will be a combination of some of these new recruits with the new skills and some of the people from the Better Regulation Division. And it will depend a little bit on the scale and size of the project, how much non-compliance or compliance they find. So we're trying to be ready to deal with the different circumstances we expect to find as we go out to the different building sites when people indicate that they're about to issue their occupancy certificate. But Mr. Dunphy, again, will have a bit more detail on how it all works exactly. I'm sorry
Well,
about
then,
that.
putting to one side, which I'll explore this with Mr. Dunphy going forward, how the organisation operates from Mr. Chandler down. How does the organisation structured from Mr. Chandler up?
So
Who is he report to, and what's his financial autonomy?
So Mr. Chandler reports directly to the Secretary of DCS, but he also has a very close working relationship with me and my colleagues in Better Regulation Division, so that we work very closely together, but technically he reports to the Secretary, yep.
What, if any, financial autonomy does he have?
He has a separate budget, and the budget has a budget for his office, and then he has a budget for this project of doing this activity under the RAB bill, and then he has another budget for various of the other pillars of his work program.
All right. What's his office budget?
I just didn't come prepared with any of that information. I'm really sorry, but I didn't expect to be these sort of questions, so I'll have to take them on notice.
All right. What's the RAB project budget?
Exactly the same. I will have to take it on notice. I just didn't come with any of those figures.
Well, then I think you can probably anticipate my next question. What, if any, other budgets does he have, and what projects or
Yeah.
what projects or work do they attach to?
Sure. Okay, we'll see what we can do. I guess the only thing I will say is just because the government hasn't issued a budget now, we're in a slightly sort of ambivalent position about budgets in general, but we can do our best to explain what we anticipate spending on these projects.
When are we going to get a budget?
Are you asking the government that?
Well, I'm asking. You must know. You
I mean,
must be anticipating
November,
a budget.
as I understand it. Sorry. Yep.
You're anticipating a budget in November, and that's what you're working
Well,
towards?
I think that's what the government announced it was going to do. Sorry. Yeah, as I understand it. I mean, they're making arrangements so that we have money to go on with, but it's sort of not as defined a budget as in the normal circumstance when a budget comes down in May.
So in terms of obtaining a budget for the building commissioner's work, where is that budget being allocated from? Is it money redistributed within the current department budget? Is it fresh money? Where's the money coming from?
I understand it's a bit of a combination of all those. I'll have to take that on notice.
And in terms of, there may well be two different answers. So if you could provide the answer for this financial year and provide the answer for the future
Coming
financial
financial
year. The design bill was also, I think, assented to this week. Just double checking. Do you know what date the design bill was assented to?
On the parliamentary website now. Sent it to on Thursday the 11th.
Thursday, yesterday. What current resources are in place to ensure that the regulations that are essential for that to actually start doing its work will be put in place in a timely fashion? What's the resourcing on the regulations?
So that
that
work is already
underway.
well advanced on the concepts and leading into the process for consultation to underpin that regulation, including during the period we didn't have access to Parliament and the bill wasn't progressing, we turned our effort to starting to do the conceptual work and development work on that regulation. So it's already started.
Sorry, so is it still at the conceptual phase? Is that my understanding, Ms Tansey? It's still at the conceptual phase?
I don't mean that to suggest it's vague.
It did sound vague.
Well, it isn't vague. Working up the key elements underneath the bill, and so the concepts, for example, would include what are all the plans and designs that might be specified in the regulation to be captured by the bill. So those critical concepts around the plans and designs to be captured, the registration system that underpins the bill, so including the different categories of practitioner that will be captured, the qualifications and pathways and prerequisites. So all of the machinery elements of the bill have been developed and are in papers that will likely become discussion papers then to thrash out the detail with industry and other stakeholders.
They're likely to become discussion papers. Is that the current status? You've got some concepts that are likely to become discussion papers?
So we have used concept papers and discussion papers all along through this process to engage with industry, yes, to test and flesh out the elements that were in the bill and are now in the Act and will be in the regulation.
You see, Mr Tansey, Parliament has previously rapidly passed legislation because we were advised, and this happened as recently as 2018, we were advised that it was dreadfully necessary that your department have additional statutory powers to provide regulations for, in that case, for the regulation of private certifiers. Now, that was in 2018. We're now in the middle of June 2020. Are those regulations now in force?
Are you referring to the certifier regulations?
Correct.
Those have been made. They will commence on the 1st of July.
So no, those ones in relation to which we rapidly passed legislation in 2018 are still not in force. They've come into force in a couple of weeks. Is that right?
That's correct.
And can you get some sense of the frustration that I think the sector is feeling when we, again, the Parliament has engaged with and passed the Design and Building Practitioners Bill. It was introduced on the 23rd of October last year, and you still haven't got a set of draft regs. You still haven't got a set of draft regs to actually show the sector. Can you see how that might cause frustration?
If you're expressing frustration, then I can see it.
Well, I think you can probably see my frustration, but let me assure you that there are many, many stakeholders that I've spoken to who had said from the outset that they didn't think your department had the capacity to produce the regulations in a timely fashion. And sitting here today, you still can't point to even a set of draft regulations for a bill that was introduced on the 23rd of October 2019. So rather than address my obvious frustration, can you provide some comfort to the industry that is looking for actual action?
The regulations have been intensively worked on. As you will well appreciate, there was some uncertainty as to the final form of the bill, so there were very significant elements of the bill itself that were still being debated by Parliament and therefore were in flux. But we have done serious development work around the documents that will be then the subject of detailed discussion with stakeholders and with other interest holders about now the precise provisions of the regulation.
Mr. Tansey, some of the core work that is needed, the bulk of the core work under the regulations about the nature of the designs, the nature of the disclosures, those aspects of the bill weren't part of kind of active amendment. 90% of the drafting could have been done before the final bill was passed. Why has none of the actual regulation drafting been done?
Mr. Shoebridge, we have been working consistently since the end of last year and all through the beginning period of this year when the bill was in abeyance, and every week since then and up to its passage with stakeholders on the detailed work. And we have had highly productive and constructive engagement with stakeholders. We have continued to work through it, and we have had, frankly, letters of thanks and congratulations as recently as yesterday from industry stakeholders about their sense of satisfaction, not only with the attainment of the bills, but the way that all the work has been done and continues to be done. So I have not had any evidence. I've not had anybody approach me expressing frustration. I have not had anybody say to me, you know, why aren't we being talked to about the elements, because we have been working with stakeholders on all of those
Mr. Tansey, would you table, you say you have these letters, I'd ask you to table or provide on notice the letters of thanks that you have from the industry that underpins that assertion.
Happy to.
I'll hand it to the opposition. All of them. Mr. Tansey?
I might continue on the where we were questioning just on the issues around price gouging. Firstly, I just wanted to ask, the choice proposal is about 120% increases in price. I'm just interested if there's a departmental view or any departmental discussions about what an appropriate level of price increase is crosses the line to become price gouging. Have you got a view, or have there been any discussions about that in the forums you're involved in?
No, I don't think we have a view. I think price gouging is not defined in the law anywhere and means different things to different people. Usually there's some sense of it not only being the amount by which the price is increased, but also the time for which that price is increased, and the other circumstances of the market in which people are operating. I, as a personal view, think it would be quite hard to put a general percentage on across the whole range of products, but we haven't come to a departmental view. No.
Yeah.
Ticket reselling is limited to 110%, isn't it?
If there's a resale restriction in the terms and conditions of the ticket sale, then the requirement is that it be no more than 10%, yes.
In relation to the shortages issue, so this is you've said there's really not any capacity, although you'll take some of this on notice, but there's not really a capacity for the state to act. In that instance, it's really down to supermarkets who might impose a certain number of items you can buy. Is there any backup for those supermarkets though? Is there any action they can take if those systems, which are really voluntary on their behalf, start to fail?
I'm really feeling outside my portfolio understanding. I assume that somewhere in public health or emergency legislation, that's not our portfolio.
No,
there might be something to allow those sort of things to happen, but I'm not sure.
To price gouging.
Yep.
One of those anecdotes, one of those stories about price gouging did relate to face masks, and it was about the face masks. Normally, so in particular was I think the P95 face masks, which would normally be sold for about $40 for about 20, were reported as being sold for $786 by a company, Livingston International. Are you aware of that report, that anecdote, that instance?
I can't recall that I've heard that specific one, but that's not to say that Fair Trading might not have heard about it, or that I didn't know about it at one particular point in time, but right off the top of my head, no, I can't recall that one.
Presumably, if it had been the subject of action or referral, you've said you don't think there have been referrals, it might be more familiar to you.
That's probably right, but I just would have to check.
Yeah, so feel free to take on notice, but I think we can assume for the moment that it hasn't, this hasn't occupied a lot of the time of Fair Trading to date. It's unlikely to have
haven't done many referrals, or if any. Yes, that's right.
That is certainly price gouging, though. If that's what's happened, you'd have to, on the face of it, that is a major problem.
It's a large price increase. I'm just a little bit reluctant to absolutely say it's price gouging, but it would certainly attract our attention as something that we should have taken a look at.
But where do you draw the line on price gouging? If not there, where's the definition of price gouging? At what multiple of the normal price does price gouging come in?
I think, as I mentioned to Mr. Graham, it's the price plus the length of time for which the price was offered, and the whole circumstances of the market in which people were operating.
So here's a...
But I'm not disagreeing that that's a large price increase. I absolutely take.
But you're refusing to accept that for the department's perspective that they'd call that a price gouge. I just don't understand why.
No, I think it would be something that if it had been brought to our attention, we would have certainly taken a look at the circumstances of it.
But you've been very careful in your answer, Ms. Webb, not to call it a price gouge, and I just wonder why.
Only because there's no definition of price gouging in the law. And so I'm just conscious of the fact that people across the board have many different views of what price gouging is. I'm not saying it's good practice or anything.
I think that is, it's sensible to be cautious about exactly where price gouging is, but common sense says if you can buy 20 masks for $40 and it's sold to you for $786, that is price gouging. Would you agree with that?
I think maybe the operative words are it is sold to you for. I mean, if it was offered for sale but no one bought it, is it price gouging or not? I'm not sure.
Well, here's a pharmacist.
I just don't have a strict definition of it, depending.
Linda Newen, who says we had quotes from the company back in January costing about $40. Now they would cost $700 to $800, depending on the brand, and that's still for 20 masks per box. This is Livingston International selling to a pharmacist, regularly purchasing these items. Surely that is price gouging.
I'm not trying to be obstructive here. It's just that price gouging, I mean, I would want to ask what price the wholesaler was paying for them to get them before, and knowing what margin they were putting on them before they sold them to the retailer, before I gave an absolute definitive view on that. But I certainly absolutely think it's worth looking at.
One way to answer that question is to look at what the competitors might be selling
Exactly.
that for.
Yep.
Now, their prices were up from $40. They were at about $80. So double,
Yep.
you know,
Yep.
in a very constrained market. And we acknowledge there were real problems here.
Yep.
But so competitors were selling them for double the price, but this company is selling it for $786.
So that would be very good evidence that they were putting a very high margin on it, which tends to show is something like price gouging. I absolutely agree.
Yeah. And is the agency aware of this example?
I can't speak on behalf of the agency, but we'll take it on notice and just check if we had heard of it.
This is a company
Sorry,
headquartered
Mr. Graham.
Yeah.
I will come back to this in just one second. Mr. Dunphy has just arrived. So, Mr. Dunphy, I think your socially distanced chair is there on your left.
I'll just make, you want to
Just
swear?
swearing. Yeah.
Affirmation.
And Mr. Dunphy, I think you've done this very recently in another room.
That's correct.
So I'll just let you go.
Yeah, thank you. It's Peter Dunphy. I'm the Executive Director for Compliance and Dispute Resolution at Department of Customer Service. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thanks, Mr. Dunphy. Mr. Graham.
I was about to make the point that this is a company headquartered in New South Wales, not far from here, in Mascot. Why hasn't this, it's been publicly reported, it was the subject of quite a lengthy public report. Why hasn't this come to the department's attention?
I think I was said that I'm not sure whether it has or hasn't. I'll take on notice whether it has. I'll find out what we did about it or didn't do about it, and take all of that on notice and let you know.
Yeah. I have to say, Ms. Webb, that it's in the face of, we know there were widespread issues. It is very surprising that the agency comes and says, we haven't heard much. I think that does raise some questions about to what extent people think this is a channel which is going to be successful. But I'm even more surprised that this has not been the subject of attention or
and
regulation.
as I say, we weren't waiting for people to come to complain to us. We were looking for it as well because we were acutely conscious of this issue and people's interest in it. And the Minister did put out a media release saying he would name and shame people using his public warning powers. But
and I think you could tell us that the Minister certainly didn't name and shame this company, did he?
No, he didn't. But that wasn't, we were definitely looking for circumstances in which it would be appropriate for him to do that, and we didn't have any.
Yeah.
So I will be able to follow up that particular example.
Can you think of any reason why this wouldn't have been an instance of price gouging?
Look, I don't want to answer hypothetically without going back and reviewing our files, but speaking generally, the ones that did come to our attention, stories like this, when we went and investigated, we found that the price was no longer, in most cases, we found that the price that had been reported was no longer the price that was being offered because people had been able to get supply from somewhere else. I'm not saying that's the case in this one, but that tended to be what happened, that we found an example. We thought it was something that we should look into. We thought it was a possibility for the Minister to issue a public warning about, but the minute we tried to get some concrete evidence to show that this conduct was going on, it wasn't there. That's typically what happened for us.
Thank you.
Yeah. You finished on?
Yeah.
Yep. Ms. Webb, in relation to the issue of cladding, now given that during the pandemic more people than ever before have been working from home, and obviously their home has become their work environment, what progress has the task force made in relation to removing cladding from residential buildings?
This has
I'll
been
ask,
ruled on previously.
COVID or
Yeah, during COVID?
completely unrelated to COVID?
Is that, sorry,
No.
Ms. Ward, no, is that a point of order?
Point of order, Chair. I must be mistaken. I thought I was in the COVID hearing, the government response to the COVID pandemic. It appears that I'm in budget estimates or some other alternative hearing.
Not so.
Is that the point of order?
Well, I asked that the witnesses come here today prepared to answer questions about the COVID pandemic. There's been quite a bit of wiggle room given and breadth given to questions, but I think it's unfair to then extend it to any question at any time about any matter that might occur, and I ask that you, in fairness to the witness, ask members to confine their questions to something that is in some way related to the terms of reference being the government's response to the COVID pandemic.
Well, I did listen carefully to the question, and it was phrased in the context, and I think it's a valid context, about the issues about working from home, and I myself will probably have some questions about issues from working from home and SafeWork's role in that regard. So I do think it is within the terms of reference. How it's answered, though, is a matter for the witnesses. Question is in order, if you remember it, Ms Webb.
What progress has been made? I'm not sure if Mr Dunphy came equipped with his statistics,
happy for you to take it on
he
notice
may
if
be
you
able to answer a little bit.
Look,
Mr Dunphy, the question was about action in relation
sorry,
to...
Mr Tansey.
Mr.
Tansey. It was about...
well, look, so the task force has absolutely continued to meet. We met for the 64th meeting yesterday, and we're continuing to meet every 3 weeks routinely. I'm just looking to call up the statistics and compare it, for argument's sake, back to whenever you might consider that we went into the COVID period, but let's say, February sometime. I'm happy to try and get the statistics here from my files. As you all know, they are published every week to the Cladding Task Force website, so if you wanted to find them yourselves, they're also available there.
Okay.
Sorry, the parliamentary network appears to be very slow.
That's okay. Look, I'm happy for you to come back to that.
I will endeavour while we're
sitting
to give you some comparative numbers.
That's okay. Mr Dunphy, is COVID-19 a notifiable incident?
So under the legislation, there is requirements to notify particular matters, and in terms of notification of COVID, if it meets the definition, it would be a notifiable matter. So if it's arising from the work, it is a notifiable to be notified to SafeWork, and we have had a number of notifications which we have followed up in terms of COVID.
It's okay. And I've gone before today's hearing. I went to the SafeWork website, and it says notify us. Businesses it is required to notify us of serious illnesses, including COVID-19. So that's pretty clear. In relation to Qantas, you're aware, are you, that from the end of January, 27 January, to the 2nd of February, an aircraft cleaner who was an elected health and safety representative was pursuing with Qantas issues around COVID-19 and for evidence of consultation and compliance with health and safety requirements. And obviously that person met resistance over a period of time, and I think it was on the 2nd of February Qantas stood down that health and safety representative. Is SafeWork pursuing action against Qantas in relation to that matter?
Yeah, so that matter has been notified to SafeWork, and the matter was raised, and it has initiated an investigation, which is still ongoing. So I can't really talk about the details of that. I can talk about when it was notified. We did actually go out and we did inspect the workplace at that time, around the 26th of February. There was an improvement notice issued at that particular time around cleaning procedures, and those cleaning, the issues that the improvement notice was addressing was concerns about workers using wet tissues, the cleaners handling wets and used tissues, used face masks and sold nappies, and there were questions about whether you had the appropriate personal protective equipment. We did issue an improvement notice at that time, and that has been complied with. In relation to the issue of the issue of alleged discriminatory conduct, that is an issue that's covered by the work health and safety legislation, and we are investigating that matter, which is still under investigation.
Okay. On the 5th of March, I think your report concluded, this is following the standing down of the cleaner, and the improvement notices, I think your report stated, and I quote, workers and other persons may be exposed to a risk of injury or illness from inadequate system of work used to clean planes that may have transported passengers with an infectious disease. Does that sound like Safe Work's report on the matter?
That was in relation to that improvement notice, and that was a matter that we followed up. And as I said, an improvement notice was issued, and that has been complied with.
Yeah, and you're aware that Qantas sent aircraft cleaners in Sydney letters threatening disciplinary action, including sackings, if they refused to work on planes that had come from China, and the letters referred to the risk to workers as being negligible. Is that an assessment that Safe Work agrees with?
As I said, that matter is a matter that's under investigation at present, so I can't really talk about the details of that matter, but it's something that we are looking into.
Okay, and you'd be aware that on the 18th of March, the Fair Work Commission released a statement indicating that employees who do not work because they have a reasonable concern about an imminent risk to their health and safety are not taking industrial action. You're aware of that ruling?
I'm not particularly aware of the details of
Would
that.
you make yourself aware of that ruling and fold it into any investigative role you're undertaking?
We certainly, I'm sure in terms of the broad look at the investigation, that probably is something that the investigation team's looked at, but yes, certainly we can have a look at that.
Okay. And is it the case that on the 27th of March, Safe Work served a notice on Qantas informing the airline it's under investigation and may face prosecution in relation to this matter?
We don't normally serve notices saying we're under investigation. It may be notice seeking further information, so they would normally, in the process of an investigation, we will seek notices requiring the provision of information or documents.
Okay.
Well, did that happen, Mr Dunphy, on that date? A simple question, 27th of March.
Sorry?
Did that happen on that date in regard to Qantas?
I need to confirm that, so I can't...
Okay.
can't
I'm happy for you
Sure,
to
one
take
way
that
or
on
the other.
notice and come back to the committee and would ask you to produce to the committee any notice that was issued to Qantas.
This is a matter that's currently under
Well,
investigation.
if he wants to take that
Well,
point,
I
he can.
assume Mr Dunphy will take it on notice. Is that right, Mr Dunphy?
I'll take it on notice. In terms of if we've issued a notice, I certainly can advise whether that's occurred. If it's part of the investigation, obviously.
Obviously, I'm not asking you to do anything that would jeopardise any investigation. I'm just trying to sort of find out the information. You're aware, are you, of a dossier prepared by the Transport Workers Union in relation to Qantas's attitude to risks of infection from COVID-19, and that Qantas apparently has referred in multiple communications to its workers that the risk of infection was low and compared it to having the same sort of risk as the seasonal flu? Again, in terms of the risk factor, is that an assessment of risk that Safe Work would share?
I can't comment on what was actually provided, and again, that appears to be part of the investigation, so I don't want to go into the particulars of that at present.
So I think on the 19th of May, Qantas announced a fly well plan for a return to flying during the pandemic, but had not consulted its workforce on that plan, despite government guidelines stating that employers, and I quote, must allow workers to raise and express their views on work health and safety issues that may arise directly or indirectly because of COVID-19. Are you able to advise the committee about whether that is something that Qantas has done, or whether this is something that's also covered by the investigation?
I'm not aware of the particulars of that matter, and again, I would imagine that would be part of the investigation that we're looking at.
Mr Dunphy, are you aware that on the 21st of April, a Safe Work inspector issued an improvement notice on Qantas, alleging that Qantas failed to notify Safe Work New South Wales of a notifiable incident as required by Section 38 of the Act and 699 of the regs?
That's correct, yes. I am.
Okay. And part of the contention was that Qantas had 47 workers that had tested positive for COVID-19, and that included workers who had received treatment as inpatients in hospital and those who had pursued workers' compensation matters. Is that your understanding?
I don't know the particulars of the matter, but I do know that we issued improvement notices at that time, yes.
Okay. And you're aware, are you, that at the time when the improvement notice was issued, Qantas had not notified Safe Work New South Wales of any COVID-related notifiable incidents? Is that your understanding?
That was the basis of the improvement notice, yes.
Yes. Now, that improvement notice was subsequently set aside on an internal review. Is that your understanding?
That's correct. The improvement notice was there. There is a right of review as with all of our notices and inspector actions, and there was a request for an internal review. The internal review is done quite independently of the inspectorate, and the review determined that the notice should be set aside.
Okay, well, I've run out of question time, but I might return to this.
At any point, was the Minister advised of the fact that there had been the improvement notice issued?
I don't have that information to hand at present. I don't believe that we notify of every matter that occurs, but there may have been, in terms of general information, that may have been communicated, but I'd need to check that.
So you'll check that and provide an answer on notice?
I can check that, yes. Yep.
Yes, and provide an answer on notice?
Yes.
Was the Minister advised of the request for an internal review?
I'm not aware of that. The internal review is not done within an area that I have responsibility for, so I'm not too sure what the
Who does? Who's sitting here? Has Mr. Gavriladis?
So recently that area has come into my group. I'm not aware if the Minister would have been told of that or not.
Will you find out and let us know?
I can ask that question.
Did the Minister have any involvement in any of the any of the investigation, the issuing of the improvement notice, or the request for and/or obtaining of an internal review? Did the Minister have any involvement at any stage?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. But you may not be aware of that. You may not be aware of the Minister's involvement, given your state of knowledge. Is that right, Mr. Gavriladis?
I cannot answer. It's up to the Minister to answer that question, not me, what his involvement might be. But
Does
from
the
our
department...
From the department's perspective, at least from mine, in terms of recently taking over that area, I'm not aware of anything that would have gone to the Minister about that.
Will you check will you take on
check,
notice
yes.
and provide an answer
Absolutely.
based upon the departmental records?
Yes.
Mr. Dunphy, there are a series of questions asked in your absence, and the assumption was that you might have
They blamed him.
I was being polite. They directed it to your empty chair, Mr. Dunphy, and it's now no longer empty. So
Fault, I think, was the common phrase.
well, I think it was a bureaucratic way of just assigning responsibility to you, would be the polite description. The RAB bill, the Residential Apartment Buildings Powers Bill, it's, if I understand correctly, there is a recruitment process in the field at the moment for authorised officers to be appointed under that bill. Is that right?
That's correct. We are in the process of organising recruitment. So those positions were advertised, and we're just going through the recruitment process at present to recruit authorised officers who will be able to enforce the RAB bill, as with other legislation that fair trading also administers.
Yes. So, sorry, that last gloss has confused me a little. Are they being recruited for general work within fair trading, or are they being recruited to perform the work as authorised officers?
They are being recruited to do the work of authorised officers, so particularly set up to focus on the occupation certificate audit program, which is looking at ensuring that the requirements in the RAB bill are being complied with, but also checking in terms of the obligations for the various duty holders under the RAB bill.
All right. How many positions are being recruited now?
At present, there are 10 that are being recruited.
And is that the intended headcount for those positions? Is it limited to 10?
From what I understand, it's up to 30, so we will be doing it in batches of recruitment.
So what does up to 30 mean? Does that mean 11?
No, it means that the intention is to recruit 30 positions, which will be part of that team, which will be doing the occupation certificate audits.
So this isn't like, up to 75% off.
No.
This is
The intention is to get
to recruit 30
We may not
positions.
find 30 people, but the intention is to recruit 30.
All right. And what's the time frame for that recruitment?
So the current recruitment's underway at present. The intention, I think, is to, in terms of dates, I don't think dates have specifically been set for the next batches, but we would be looking in the second half of this year.
So to have all 30 recruited by the end of this year, is that the intent?
It will be over this year, so my expectation is that it would be we would be looking recruitment of the other two in the second half. Yes.
The other two being the other 20?
The other 20.
Yes. Are there additional staff that are being brought in from within the department to do the work of authorised officers to add to the 30?
That are the 30 that we're recruiting at present. So no, in terms of the department, there will be other people who will also be able to assist with the inspections. They will use. So we will be looking at how broadly we provide those powers to other authorised officers within fair trading.
But in terms of people whose job is ascribed to do that work on a 9 to 5 basis or 8:40 to 4:40 basis, the intent is to have 30 dedicated officers.
That's correct.
And no more at this stage.
And they will be complemented by the other building inspectors who also will be doing inspections that relate to the same issues of building integrity and building safety, and will also be complemented by the inspectors within Safe Work who are also will be working closely with those authorised officers to look at issues of building safety as well.
Do you have an organisational chart that you can share which will show where these officers sit?
I believe the Building Commissioner has published one on his website. So there is one that is now available, which is available on the website, which I can provide.
Okay. In terms of and will the 30 inspectors report directly to the Building Commissioner? What's the arrangements, the organisational arrangements?
So the arrangements are essentially there's dual reporting functions to the Building Commissioner, and they also report through to the Compliance and Dispute Resolution team as well.
Which is whose responsibility?
That's my responsibility. And that's to make sure that we're consistent in terms of with all the compliance officers, that there is a consistent approach and we're integrating our approaches to building safety and also building standards across fair trading, those particular regulatory officers, and also across Safe Work.
So who's going to be directing their day-to-day work?
Primarily the Building Commissioner in terms of, so the Building Commissioner is working very closely with the team that is, in terms of the setup. He's very focused on ensuring that we'll be able to deliver in terms of the outcomes of the RAB. So we're working very closely with the Office of the Building Commissioner to develop the program. They will be reporting through in terms of progress and the detail, and the Building Commissioner will have a role in terms of be working closely on the ground with them as well.
Have a role. So the Building Commissioner will have a role. It doesn't sound to me like he's going to be directing their day-to-day work.
He will be determining the program, and he is at present.
All right. So my question I thought was quite simple.
Yeah.
Who's going to be directing the day-to-day work of the 30 inspectors? Mm-hmm. And is there a simple answer to it? Is it the Building Commissioner or is it yourself?
The Building Commissioner will be setting the program of works, and also ensuring what gets done, and ensuring that that team is performing what needs to be achieved as part of the program of works under the RAB bill. In terms of the day-to-day HR functions, in terms of checking people doing their flex sheets and all of those sorts of things, that will be done administratively through my group.
I was more interested in terms of checking and saying, would you mind going out and checking Mascot Towers, please,
Yep.
Janice?
That will definitely be the
direction.
Building Commissioner who will be doing that. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
I asked some questions earlier about specific budget items, and you may have these figures to hand. Do you know what the budget of the Building Commissioner's office is?
No, and I didn't come prepared for that.
Right.
Yes.
Do you know what the budget for the RAB project is, the Residential Apartment Buildings Powers and Compliance project? Do you know what that budget is?
No, not for the whole, in terms of the whole project. No, that would be something the Building Commissioner would need to provide advice on.
All right. Ms. Webb, on a different tack, you will recall on the previous occasion there were questions asked about the data in relation to tenancies, to evictions and terminations and the like, and you gave some evidence about the number of disputes that had been concluded. Do you have an updated figure?
Mr Gavriladis has those numbers. Yeah.
So are you asking specifically just the requests for intervention? Are they the numbers that you want, or just generally about what?
Well, why don't we start there, requests for intervention?
All right. So we have had 100 matters that we have intervened on. Of those, 65 resulted in an agreed outcome between the landlord and tenant. 17 concluded with the parties being unable to agree, and 18 concluded with one of the parties being unwilling to participate in the negotiation. We also have, I think, approximately 54 which are still in progress. So we've managed 100, and there's about 150, 160.
So what happens with those 35 where people didn't agree?
Sorry?
What happens to the 35 where people didn't agree?
We would not be able to assist any further except to refer them to the tribunal.
And then there are some 54 that are still in the pipeline, is that right?
Correct.
How many have you tracked eviction numbers since this COVID-19 incident has struck? Have you tracked eviction numbers?
We are not able to track eviction numbers. They would be matters that would go to the tribunal, but they also may not even get to the tribunal if people, leave following an eviction. We are looking to seek some information from the tribunal at the moment to at least find out how many matters have gone there, but I don't have that answer.
I think that's where we were on the last occasion.
Yeah,
You were
precisely
looking
where
to
it
have
was.
a discussion with
Yes.
with NCAD. What's happened?
Well, we haven't yet, and I'm hoping to do that.
So, Gavriladis, how is it that in the weeks that have ensued since the last occasion, and when you acknowledge this, I think it'd be fair to say, critical lack of data, how is it you haven't even had a meeting with NCAD? I mean,
Well, I apologise for that. I haven't, but I am seeking to get that data.
well, is NCAD refusing to come to the table? Is that where the problem is?
I've not engaged and therefore not been able to provide that information. I will do so, and I apologise for not having done that already.
So you haven't even approached NCAD?
I haven't approached NCAD at this stage, no.
What about accessing data in relation to bonds? Have you looked if there's any patterns in terms of access to rental bonds? Do you have access to that data?
I haven't done so. Usually that data is looked at, and reports are provided by housing on the bonds data.
Well, but
But yes, I can access it, yes, absolutely.
you can, but you haven't.
I have not, no.
Given the fact that the Parliament gave specific powers to try and help people who are having very real rental concerns, given that only 154 people in the whole of New South Wales have accessed it, and given you haven't sought to access the data from either the bonds, rental bonds, or from NCAD, how do you know that what you're doing is having any material effect?
Well, we know that we've had at least almost 300,000 views of our rental moratorium page on our website, so people are engaging. We do know that. We know that there have been 74,200 views of the property page and also 6,800 views of the strata page. Almost... So,
if website views,
considerable interaction where people have come to our website or have engaged online, and of those we've only had, as I said, 150, 160 requests for intervention.
Is it really the case, Ms. Webb, that one of your the sole substantive indicator that you can point to for the utility of the work your office has done in the rental space is website views?
No.
Is that what you're pointing to, website views?
No, I think Mr. Gavrilidis was just giving that as one indicator. We've had many meetings with stakeholders, including the tenants union, who you'll be aware we were funding to make sure they were able to assist tenants as well. We've had discussions at the Rental Bond Board, and we've had a number of engagements with all stakeholders in the sector. So what we're finding is that people are aware of the moratorium. We understand from that anecdotal evidence that we're getting from people like the Tenants Union that many people are able to resolve issues with their landlords outside needing to come and get a formal intervention by fair trading. But we're also dealing with inquiries and putting people on the right track. And we're monitoring the rental bond figures at the moment. They're not showing a massive, decline or increase or decrease. The figures are pretty consistent, as I understand, from the Rental Bond Board meeting last week. So we're just keeping an eye on all these indicators.
I'm just having trouble squaring your evidence, Ms. Webb, with
Yep.
what Mr. Gavrilidis just told us about the rental bond figures.
Oh,
So
sorry,
can you tell me...
Mr. Gavrilidis is not a member of the Rental Bond Board, so I was just referring to the fact that at the meeting last week, they did show some figures and it didn't seem to show anything particular, but we will continue to keep an eye on them. Yeah.
Well, can you provide us with the figures
Yes,
in
absolutely.
terms of...
Yeah.
Are the figures done on a weekly or a monthly basis?
I see them, at the Rental Bond Board meeting, but their rental bonds is online, so I think we do that. We can almost do that daily, but I'll find that out and give you a figure. The most
Well, I don't know if I
over
want a
time?
figure. I want to know
You want
what's
over
been
a time
happening
series?
and
Yeah.
compared to what we would have
Absolutely.
expected absent the COVID-19.
compared to this time last year or something like
Correct.
that. Okay, we can do that.
Mr. Tansey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, Chair, I was going to follow up to that. I mean, the other element where we're trying to monitor this, and I think you personally inquired into this last time we were here, was through the rental bond survey that we ran.
Correct.
And we did, I think we took some questions on notice last time, but I can confirm that we also extended that survey specifically in an attempt to capture the COVID environment. And although the originally designed survey, as it remains, wasn't designed, none of us knew COVID was coming, so it was asking a consistent set of questions that weren't particularly predicting COVID, but we did send just over 24,000 invitations in the survey period from April onwards when the survey was extended, and so far we've got 2,835 responses for that period as well. And I think that sample was particularly between April and May thus far. So we are going through the process at the moment of cleansing and analysing that data. As I said, although the survey wasn't originally designed to capture COVID-related matters, it does still ask questions about why tenancies ended, and so we're hoping to get some insights through that process as well.
To the extent that any data is available, some substantive analysis of that, are you able to provide that on notice, Mr. Tansey?
Yeah, look, happy to do that. As I said, we are literally undertaking the cleansing and analysis now, so it might take a little time, but yeah, happy to take that request on notice and provide the data when it's available.
And Ms. Webb, you'll provide
we'll
the
get
numbers.
some more rental bond data as well for you, yes.
And Mr. Gavrilidis, will you endeavour to
Speak to the tribunal.
obtain the data from the tribunal?
I will do so, and also the housing report is available on the FACTS website in terms of dwellings, medium weekly rents and bonds lodged.
All right. Well, I think I have a short period of time that might be needed to hand it over to the opposition at this point.
Okay. Mr. Dunphy, can you indicate whether Qantas has notified any COVID-19 incidents to Safe Work?
I'm not able to confirm at this point whether they have. I'd need to check that, but I can take that on notice.
Yeah, if you could take it on notice whether they have, and if so, what the dates were of those notifications, and if you are able to do so, what those notifications were. In relation to the matter we were discussing, I think you confirmed that on the 21st of April, a Safe Work Inspector issued an improvement notice to Qantas, but that was the subject of an internal review. Now, I think it was the Manager Governance and Appeals Unit in Safe Work who decided on the 19th of May to set aside that improvement notice. Can you inform the committee why the improvement notice was set aside?
It was on the basis of a number of assessments of the notice, and primarily the reviewer didn't believe there was enough evidence to link the COVID cases to work for it to be work related.
Okay. And did that reviewer have before him or her the information that 47 Qantas workers had tested positive and that a number of those had pursued and had been given workers' compensation claims?
I believe that was all taken into consideration, and you must realise that a workers' comp claim is different to the criteria for notification under the Work Health and Safety legislation.
But
so they were
prima
looking,
facie it indicates a connection with work, does it not? I mean, workers' comp claims are not granted routinely if the injury doesn't arise from work.
Well, it is a no-fault system, so it.
Yeah, I understand, but there has to be a connection with work. You can't be injured at home on the weekend or playing sport and make a workers' comp claim, Mr. Dunphy, can you?
Well, there are some deeming provisions in COVID-19.
Okay, well,
so
we'll leave that as one side. But
There are since then, and I think there's also the issue of as a no-fault claim, you can make a claim, and whether it finally gets accepted at the end is another matter. And but in terms of the review would have purely been looking at the obligations under the Work Health and Safety Act and whether the notice was properly issued or not.
okay. Are you able to provide us with a copy of that review decision?
I can check. I'd need to confirm that.
I'm happy for you to take that on notice.
Yes.
Do you do data? Do you try and get data matching with CIRA or iCare to see if you're getting the notifications? Because surely that would be a good starting point, wouldn't it? As Mr. Searle says, if someone's put a workers' comp claim in alleging exposure to COVID, surely that would be a good indicator they should be contacting you. Do you have that kind of arrangement with either CIRA or iCare?
We do meet regularly with CIRA and iCare, and we have raised the issue about COVID, and CIRA does actually publish their data on their website, and we have talked about.
I think we asked similar questions with regards to dust diseases. If
We did.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So there is the ability to be able to get information from CIRA, and we do actually gather information from them.
Mr. W, just be clear, I'm going to take that as no, that you don't have arrangements in place to have that data sharing. The fact that you can do it, the fact that you've had some meetings, doesn't really answer my question, so I'm going to read from that no.
I think that wouldn't be the correct interpretation in this particular
Well, perhaps Mr.
circumstance.
Shoebridge can pursue that in his
because,
question time.
We definitely have been talking with CIRA and working with them very closely in relation to the COVID-19 response.
Well, I'm just telling you
Yes.
what my assumption is that was a no, but anyhow.
That's okay. So Mr. Dunphy,
No, we can't.
do I understand your evidence correctly? The reviewer took the view that the inspector's notice wasn't properly issued because there wasn't the requisite connection between work and COVID-19. Is that right?
There were a number of issues I understand in terms of the review, but that was one of the primary issues. Yes.
But you've agreed that COVID-19 is a notifiable incident if it occurs in the workplace.
If it arises from the work.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so this review, was it a desktop review, or did the reviewer go out on the ground into the Qantas workplaces and do an independent assessment?
The reviews are done independently, and they will gather whatever evidence they need to do that review.
In this particular case, was it a desktop review of documents only, or did the reviewer go out into the field?
I wouldn't be able to tell you one way or the other, and I don't have the details of the review process and what was carried out.
And does the reviewer work for you in your unit?
No. they don't. It's
You made that
separate.
clear
It's an
earlier.
independent group.
Okay. All right.
And very much we try to, for the whole purpose of making sure that there is that natural justice, we try to keep, there is quite a strong distinction between an internal review and the work that we do in the compliance area.
Okay. And which area of safe work or better regulation conducts the review?
That's the community engagement.
And what's the sort of qualifications of the person who did the review? Are they an inspector, or have they been an inspector in the past?
That they are inspectors generally.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Okay. Is this matter now the subject of proceedings in the Industrial Relations Commission of New South Wales?
That's right. So there's two levels of appeal. You can appeal for an internal review. If any of the parties are unhappy with the outcome of the internal review, then it's open to the parties to review that to the IRC, and that's currently a matter that's being considered by the IRC.
Okay. Have hearing dates or a hearing date been set?
I understand that it has been, the hearings have commenced.
Okay. Happy to.
Great. I might return to the price gouging issue. While Choice is raising these issues and suggesting perhaps that New South Wales might want to secure its own powers to act in this limited way, I'm just interested in the view you would like to express about some of the previous areas where the state has regulated this activity. So firstly on ticketing, what's the agency's view about how successful that scheme has been?
Sorry, can you just ask that question again?
So Choice is saying now we should take price gouging action. I'm just interested in there's one example of where there was two examples of where the state has done this. Does the agency think it's been a success or not?
Yeah.
Is it a...
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
get it, yeah.
Completely from my recollection, because I didn't bring any of our ticket material with me.
Yes, understood, yeah.
Completely from my recollection, the number of complaints we've had about ticket scalping has decreased since that legislation came into effect. So I guess from one perspective, in terms of complaints to fair trading, perhaps it's been
There
successful
have
in
been
addressing some of the
external
issues.
factors on the number of tickets sold of late.
During this
Well, no,
particular
no,
period.
no,
that is
sorry.
also true. Yeah.
I'm recollecting the brief I had for the previous estimates hearing. That was my
Yes,
recollection.
Yeah. And I think if you could update us, given that this other matter might be the subject of some discussion, I think if you could update it, that is price gouging powers, if you could update us about the drop in complaints, that would be useful. I think that some of that has come about in addition because of ACCC action. That's the other.
And some national law, yes, that's right.
Correct, yeah. But you think, so complaints have dropped. I mean, there's still anecdotes that tickets are clearly circulating outside the regulatory action. Have you got any agency views, though, about whether or not that is the case?
Well, I think, as the Chair mentioned, right at this moment, there's not much ticket activity happening.
Okay,
But
yeah, sure.
I think in general, the combination of some of the litigation that the ACCC took, the changes to the Australian consumer law that are proposed, and the New South Wales legislation, does seem to have at least increased some transparency and reduced the number of complaints.
So you would see, for example, in the suite of measures that have been taken in that instance, the New South Wales legislation is one of the legs of a successful, potentially successful intervention into...
Yeah, I would find it very difficult to attribute how much of that was due to increased the other measures and how much was the 10% rule, but in general, yes.
Yeah. But it was one, but it's not unfair to represent the agency's view as it was one successful leg of a set of interventions. You'd agree with that?
Yes, in the terms of there was a whole set of interventions and overall they've decreased complaints, yes, I agree.
And that's probably the most, comparable example of it's 110% price cap.
It's a provision that if the original ticket seller has a term and condition that tickets are not to be resold, and then people do resell them, then the 10% limit applies. So yes, that's how it works.
So it's not the same, but it's not a world apart from the model Choice is proposing for 120%. cap on certain specific items?
I personally find them quite different because I think the resale restriction, the fact that the 110% only applies in the limited circumstances of a resale restriction, where someone has deliberately said they don't want there to be an aftermarket in the tickets, and then the government has intervened to say, well, if there is that aftermarket, the price should be limited, is quite different from the choice situation where they're talking about goods that clearly do have an aftermarket and trying to control the prices in that aftermarket that's freely operating otherwise. So I find it quite different.
Okay, thank you for that, that distinction. That's one of the issues that we should consider. Can I ask about the second, what was regarded as the second, well, I read this was very successful, the former Minister Keane's intervention into the baby formula market. The Minister received quite a lot of publicity about his crackdown on... You'll be unsurprised to hear the Minister got very good publicity about his crackdown on...
Works hard at it.
Well, at least one of them does. Positive publicity.
On baby formula sales. What happened here? What form of regulation did the agency end up adopting?
So I'm pretty sure that occurred before I became Fair Trading Commissioner. So maybe one of my colleagues who was around at the time might have a little bit more background. I'm sort of just not aware of the whole action that he took. No.
It was mainly driven through an enforcement campaign, which personally I wasn't involved in. But
Okay, we'd have to take some detail on notice for that one.
Followed a well-tried formula.
Yeah.
I won't press the case then, but I might ask you, I think it would be helpful to, if you could take it on notice, whether any regulation actually changed.
Okay.
Was any action taken in this area following the Minister's announcement? And does the agency regard it as being a success or not, as an example of regulation? I will say I admire the Minister's announcement. It was received quite spectacularly. I have been less able to find any example of regulatory action afterwards, but I'd be happy to be contradicted. But as we're looking at this choice example, if you could provide something on notice, that'd be helpful. I might just finally turn to that. Return to that rental. Just alerting my colleagues.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm poised.
It's been 2 hours of my life. I'm getting it back.
No interjections. We could go longer.
Interjections are disorderly, and we'll probably allow the clock to continue.
Just to the complaints, just to ask for an update on the number of... I'm now, asking about residential tenancy. And you gave us the figures for complaints last time, which were, I think, from my point of view, surprisingly limited, but you gave us quite a good breakdown of those complaints or issues that had been received. Can you just give us an update of those?
Are you asking in terms of how many were, what the outcome of those
Complaints about...
No. So last time you gave us a rundown on a couple of different aspects. I think you said how many complaints had been received, then how many had gone on to NCAT, and then how many had been resolved. That's my recollection.
Well, I wouldn't have been able to give how many have actually gone on to NCAT because that's... But we have received 100...
No, sorry, yes.
We know that.
Yes.
Yes, I've already... Well, I thought I'd already
You gave us three
given that
sets of
answer
numbers
earlier, but
last
it's 100 that we've actually intervened in. There's 54 that are still in progress. Of those, 65 resulted in an agreed outcome between the landlord and the tenant. 17 cases, as I had previously said, concluded with parties being unable to agree, and 18 concluded with one of the parties being unwilling to participate in the negotiation.
Okay, and presumably they're all from tenants?
Not necessarily, no.
Right, so how many were...
I haven't got that figure in front of me.
So you're saying some of them might have been from
landlords? Some may
landlords?
well have been from landlords as well.
Okay, so if you could give us a tenant-landlord breakdown for those figures, that'd be good. I might...
Thank you. Mr Dunphy, just in relation to Qantas again and the health and safety...
in touch again, have they?
No, I've had no communications. But in relation to the health and safety representative being stood down, I think you described that matter as an ongoing investigation. Do I understand from that that no legal process has been initiated?
It's in the investigation phase, as I
That's okay.
understand it, yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that's okay.
So that can take some time, but
Okay.
yeah, as far as I'm aware, it hasn't yet been determined the outcome of the investigation.
Okay, and in relation to COVID-19 being notifiable, or COVID-19 incidents being notifiable incidents, has that been SafeWorks' consistent position, or has it recently changed?
No, we've been quite consistent from the very beginning in terms of notification and the requirements, and there is information on the SafeWork Australia website which actually provides all of the positions of all of the jurisdictions, and it's been very clear from the beginning that that COVID in certain circumstances is a notifiable occurrence.
Okay, so you haven't expressed a contrary view in any correspondence that it wasn't notifiable?
Not that, no, I don't believe so.
Okay. Okay, thanks. David, do you have any further questions?
I do not. No further questions?
No, I think that's...
Okay, well, I'll now pass over to the government for their round of questions.
Oh, nah.
No, nothing more. Mr Dunphy, Mr Tansey, Ms Webb and Mr Gavriladis, thank you very much for your attendance and assistance today. A number of questions were taken on notice, and if you could provide those, there's a maximum period of 21 days to provide those answers on notice, and that concludes today's hearing.
Thank you.